Welcome to the best class on the history of video games you will ever attend at this school in this room. When I applied for teaching here, I said on my cover letter that I would love to one day teach about the history of video games. And then during the interview, they said, yeah, that's actually one of the classes that we have here, which proved I didn't do my homework before I went to the interview, but actually made me super happy because I thought I'd have to start teaching and then convince them in order to have a history of video games class. So here we are. So let me ask you the first question. Why does your computer have a drive called C? Why is your hard drive called C? Does anybody know? Ben? You don't know? You raised your hand and then shook your head? Okay. Anybody know? Because back when computers were big and chunky and slow, we had these things called disk drives. And the big disk drive is a 5¼ inch disk drive, and that was your A drive. Why was that your A drive? Because it was the first drive that was connected to the motherboard of your computer. The second one, the smaller one, is a 3½ inch drive, and that drive is your B drive. Why is it B drive? Because A was already taken, so it plugs into the second part of your computer. And then you have a hard drive inside that you can't see, and that hard drive is called C, because it's the next letter that is available right in that list. Okay? So, do any of your computers have floppy drives? It's not a trick question. It's a big fat no. Okay? But we still call it C. And so this to me is a great example of the reason why things are the way they are today is because of stuff that happened in the past. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. But it just proves that there's a lot actually that's going on because of decisions that were made in the past. There were reasons for it in the past. So why study history like at all? Yeah, good one. So we don't repeat the same mistakes. Anything else? Erica, right? Yeah. Great answer. Learn from the past, make it better. Did you have an answer up here? No? Okay. This is a bunch of pictures of cars and people. And when you look at the video game industry today, you'll see a bunch of stuff. You'll see cars and you'll see people. But when you zoom out and you look at it as a whole, in context, you make a ton of money. No, that's not the point. When you look at it in context, you start to see the patterns. You start to see like, oh, there's actually something more going on here than just a bunch of random stuff. There's a reason Microsoft and PlayStation are the big consoles right now. Okay? There's a specific event that happened that caused Sony to get into the video game industry. Okay? It didn't happen by chance. It wasn't just like, oh, that seems like a good thing to do. There's a pivotal moment that happened as to why Sony even exists in the video game industry. Okay, so I need to give you a course overview. Here's what we're really going to do. We're going to go through history focused on the platforms first, okay, and understand what the hardware is, understand how to understand the hardware. Okay, so I'm going to give you a primer on hardware. We will be going from the prehistory to 1983 today, so Baffle Ball to what's called Generation 2. Then the next class will be 83 to 93, which is called Generation 3 and 4. These generations come from the consoles, and there's a lot of ways to slice and dice history, but the consoles is the easiest, most familiar way to do that. And so that's what these generations are, is generations of home consoles. Then we do 1993 to 2005, and that's Generation 5 and 6, and then 2005 to today. And then we're going to go back and trace specific genres and how those genres came to be and analyzing the key games within those genres. And that's what's special about this course, and you're never going to see anywhere else. So we are going to trace adventure games, simulation games, role-playing games, strategy games, sports games, puzzle games, action games, platformers, first-person shooters, and MMOs. We're also going to talk about the 20 key designers there's like 100 key designers, there's 1,000 key designers, or whatever. Same thing with hardware. I mean, there's a bunch of hardware that's not going to appear in here. I chose the best, most familiar, most key kind of things. Same thing for designers. So if your favorite designer doesn't show up, I apologize ahead of time. And then if we have time, in the 15th class, we will talk about the near future, 2020, what's about to come out in 2020 and beyond, make some predictions about what those things are going to be, and then you'll see next year what actually happens. Homework-wise, you can expect about 2 hours of homework per week from this class, and there will be no homework today. If there was to be a textbook, I'm not allowed to give you a textbook, but if there was to give you a textbook, it would be this book called The Ultimate History of Video Games. This is just one of many that I've read. Read it a year ago or whatever, and it's incredible. It's really good. And so I highly recommend it. You can get it as an audiobook, and so you can just listen to it, like, I don't know, jogging, driving the car, going places, whatever. Okay, so we're going to start with a hardware primer so that you understand what hardware is. This is a hardware primer for artists, okay? It would be different if you were computer science people. This is a graph of CPUs. CPUs are the things in your machine that make it go. Basically, if there was no CPU, it wouldn't be able to calculate or do anything. So this is CPUs. Now, this graph is kind of misleading. Obviously, the graph goes upwards to the right over time, but it's a logarithmic graph. And what that means is you see 1 is listed there near the bottom, right? 1. And then the next step is 10. The next step is 100. So every time you go up a unit, it's 10 times more powerful. Okay? So when you look at when we hit 1,000,000 up at the top, like it's 1,000,000 times more powerful than the things earlier on. And you look at the time frame here, 1970 to 2010. In 40 years, we've improved the processor speeds by 1,000,000. Like there is nothing else in history that has improved that much, that fast, okay, by 1,000,000. Okay, so that's the CPU. Now, in order to understand CPUs and GPUs and that kind of stuff, we need to understand some of the basic building blocks of that. And the most basic building block is the bit. The bit is a 1 or a 0. You've probably heard that before, okay? It's a 1 or it's a 0. Now, what can you do with a bit? You could define 1 and 0. That's all you could do with a bit. It's completely useless in and of itself. But if you were to get 8 of them and stick them together, then you can start to signal things, almost like icons, right? You could say, well, if this has a 1 and that has a 1, then that's an A. And if this has a 1 and that has a 0 and that has a 1, that's a B, right? So it's in combination that you can start to create things, okay? So 8 bits equals 1 byte. And you've heard bytes before, and you will hear bytes. 2 bytes together is called a word, and that doesn't matter. You never need to remember that. But that's what 16-bit means. So you can see just by looking at an 8-bit byte versus a 16-bit word, you can define a lot more information in 16 bits than you can. And again, it's kind of logarithmic. So just to give you an example of how the bits actually work, the very, very first bit is the 1 or 0. And that's how you get odd numbers versus even numbers for any kind of number, okay? Then the second column is 2s, and then it goes up by powers of 2s, okay? So these are exponential powers of 2s. So it's 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, 32. So looking at my little example, if you make them all 0, then you get 0. If you flip on the first bit, you get a 1. If you flip on the second bit and the first bit, then you get a 3. And so the maximum number that you can get in 8 bits is 255, okay? So you will see numbers like 255 coming up, and that's the reason, because that's the most you could possibly get out of 8 bits. Does anybody know what the maximum is for 16-bit? I think it's 2.5 billion. Depends if you're using sign or unsigned. Sign is whether it has a negative or positive, okay? So we were just showing you like 0, right? 0, 1, 3. How do you get a negative 3? How would you do that? It's tricky. You'd basically drop the 128 bit and turn that into a sign. So what that means is you still have 256 values from 0 sorry, not from 0. You have 256 values, but it goes from negative 128 to positive 128, okay? Because you can't get to 255 anymore because you're using the 128 in order to signify a plus or a minus sign. So you now know more about bits and bytes than probably any other artist alive. But we'll keep going. Okay, so 1 byte, if you've heard about kilobytes or you've heard about K, 64K, 128K or something like that. Okay, so that's 1,000 bytes. I say it's 1,000, but it's actually 1024. People usually don't care about differentiating between 1024 and 1,000. It's basically 1,000. A megabyte, mega means million. Okay, so the kilo means 1,000, the mega means million. Gigabyte, that's what you're familiar with right now, right? And that's the billions. And now we are getting into the age of the terabyte. So I remember when I got my computer, I've had many computers, but I remember getting my computer and I'm like, holy cow, I just passed the gigabyte threshold. Like I got a 2 gigabyte drive. This is incredible. It's all the space I could ever need, right? And now you have a USB stick with like 64 gigs on it and your phone has 128 gigs or whatever. Anyway, so in 5 years, maybe you'll be talking terabytes on your iPhone and that kind of stuff, okay? So those are the ones that matter. Are there more numbers after this? There's about 37 numbers after these numbers, and they don't matter. These are the numbers that matter. Any questions on bits and bytes? Nope. Okay. Do pictures help? Are you artists? Yeah. That's why this is for artists. Okay, you're going to hear terms like RAM and ROM. Does anybody want to take a guess at what those are? Yeah? Okay, random access memory. Yep, that's right. And the ROM? Read-only memory, that's right. So random access memory means if there's a value in memory, say it's a 1, and I want to change it, say it's your score in Pong, and I want to change it from a 1 to a 2, I can go in there and I can change that value to a 2. Okay? That's a random access memory. I don't have to start at the beginning and sequentially like write the data. I can just jump to one part and switch the bits to what I want. Okay? ROM is read-only memory, which means once I put a 1 there, it's there forever. It can never ever change. So game cartridges, like your Nintendo Switch, for instance, will have a cartridges that is a ROM for the game because they don't want you overwriting the game and changing the game, and the game doesn't want to change the game. Okay, so that's a ROM. But then, I don't know, on the Switch, do they have saving on the little cartridges? I don't think they do. Anybody know? Switch? I know you can save to the system of the Switch. I think that's all you have, right? Okay, so it's saving to the cartridge. So the way they'll do that is they will put in some RAM and some ROM on the same cart. Okay, and so that was a big deal back in the day when Legend of Zelda came out for Nintendo, and it was like, what? You can save your progress? Like that was like unheard of, that you could like save your progress in a game. Up until that point, you had to see the game all the way through. Mario Brothers, okay, or Super Mario is what it was called. Super Mario, you had to play that sucker all 10 worlds all the way through without the power going out or somebody else wanting the TV. It's a very different world now. Okay, so quantities of bytes. Yeah, we already covered that. I don't know why that's in there. Okay, so you will see on your internet, at home, on your cell phone contract, wherever, they will talk about speed. And what is their speed measured in? Megabits. And why do they do that? Because they're cheating you, because they're cheating liars. Okay, so you look at this thing and you're like, wow, 100 megabits, that sounds amazing. Okay, I'm going to get this 100 megabit and stuff. Yeah, so a megabit is bits. And we all know that it's 8 bits to a byte. So whatever that number is, divide it by 8, and that's what your actual speed is. So they're telling you it's 100, but divide that sucker by 8, and what do you get? It's like 12, right? It's 12 megabyte. It's not that impressive anymore. Okay, so you're cheating liars, and now you can spot them because of this class. Okay, so these bits start to get important when it comes to color information. So, who's used Photoshop? Okay, should be all of you at this point. So in Photoshop, you will have choices in there about depth of color, right? So if you're working 8-bit color, that means there's only 255 shades of the color red, or 255 levels of transparency, or 255 levels of luminosity, or something like that. Okay, so that's where the 8-bit part comes from. Is like there's only 255. When you get into 16-bit, then you have 65,000 levels. Okay, so that gives you tons more gradation. When you mix 3 colors, each at 65,000, 65,000 times 65,000, or 65,000, yeah, 65,000 cubed, so 65 times 65 times 65, and you get up to 16.8 million. Okay, so that's like a lot of colors. When you're dealing in the 8-bit range, you have basically 256 colors. So it's like a huge difference. Okay, so here's another way of looking at it. If I have an 8-bit, I can get to 255. If I have 16-bit, I can get to 65,000. If I have 32-bit, I get 4.2 billion. Okay, so when you talk about a processor being a 16-bit or a 64-bit processor, a 64-bit, 32-bit processor, a 32-bit processor can process in one cycle. Imagine an engine that goes around, okay, one cycle. It can do 4.2 billion calculations like in that one cycle. So you can look at megahertz. Megahertz is like the RPM on your car, like how fast is this thing going, right? I'm at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. You can look at megahertz, and that gives you some indication, but the really important thing is how much stuff is going in one cycle. If it's an 8-bit cycle, it's 255. If it's a 16-bit, it's 65,000 in one cycle. So like the numbers start to get insane. And that's it for your hardware primer. Any questions on hardware? No? That kind of makes sense now? Because we're going to talk about hardware. Here we go. From prehistory, 1930s basically, to 1971. Our story begins with Baffle Ball. Baffle Ball was this thing that you went to at a carnival or something like that, and you paid the guy some money, and I guess 5 cents, and you were able to shoot a ball. And it was a skill shot. If anybody's played pinball and you like try to like get a certain amount of tension on the thing and get it, you know, to go over and land, hit something that's highlighted. That's all there was. No flippers, no anything. You just shot the ball, see which hole it dropped in. Hey, that was fun. Give him another nickel, get some more balls, and that was it. So somebody had the bright idea of let's throw some flippers on this thing. And so that idea of flippers came out with this thing called Humpty Dumpty in 1947. And like anybody who invented something, they're like, hey, let's just put it everywhere. So hopefully this video works. Here we go. Okay, they went from no flippers to like flippers all over the place. Okay, that's all you need to know about that. Okay, so 1951, this guy named Marty Bromley was a manager of the games room, and games at this time is pool, maybe pinball, and he works at a Hawaiian military base, and he opens up this company called Service Games. Another company in Japan, Yamachui, changes the name of a card-playing company called Marufuku to a new name. Can anybody guess what that new name is? Card-playing company that changed its name. It's a little bit famous. Yeah? Nintendo. Nintendo was a card-based company. This is their catalog. And they changed their name to Nintendo, and it means luck to heaven. In 1954, an American living in Japan, I assume he was there for military service, whatever, and then he just stuck around. He started Rosen Enterprises. And you're like, I never heard of that and stuff. But remember, Dave Rosen started Rosen. And he got into photo booths. So they still have those in malls today, where like you go in with your friend, you put in some money, and then you take a picture, woo, and then it prints it out, and then you have a thing, right? Like a Polaroid or something like that. So he imports $200,000, this is 1954 money, $200,000 of coin-operated electromechanical games in order to start a coin-op business in Japan. This guy is responsible for vending machines and coin-op machines in Japan. They didn't exist before this guy. Okay, moving to 1962, there is this game that was created in an IT lab called Space War. This is a bunch of programmers hacking around on a mainframe, and when they are, classes are done or whatever, it's kind of like this computer lab. You can just like do whatever you want. They start hacking around the thing. They're like, hey, what if we could maybe make a game? And so this is Space War. And there is the ship, and the sun is in the center, and there's like gravity sucking you towards the sun. And I just played the single player, so I didn't even do anything about that second ship. But there you go. You can shoot torpedoes, and you could hit those other guys. And then I ran into the sun. Then he ran into the sun, and then everything blew up, and that's it. So a couple of things from this. This was the first video game ever, period. Space War. It ran on a machine that cost, well, I'll tell you in a second about the machine. This game has to be PvP, player versus player. Why? Because there's no cycles for AI. So you had to play it against someone else. And you both had these weird kind of joystick things. This is when the joystick was invented. So you had these weird joystick things to try and move your ship around and shoot at each other. And people would spend all night playing Space War against each other. It was like the thing when you were in school, was to have Space War tournaments and just play and play and play, okay? It got so popular that the company, DEC, Digital Equipment Corp, made it a pack-in for their mainframe computer, okay? When they sold it, they used Space War as a way of testing the equipment to make sure that everything was working. So this is the first gaming machine, the DEC PDP-1 in 1959. And its CPU is 4 bits, a 4-bit processor. I was surprised when I saw that, running at 187 kilohertz. I was also surprised at that. We haven't even hit megahertz yet. RAM, it has 9K of RAM. And the media for like getting things in and out, getting programs in and out, punch tape. So you typed in your thing, and then you had it printed out on long, like thin pieces of paper, and the punches would be the bits. Okay, so every 8 making a byte and such. So you'd print this thing out, and then when you want to run the program again, you'd go up to a feeder, and you'd have like their stack of paper, and you feed it in, and it would start sucking it in, and it would just like suck it in like a skipping rope, and read all the punch out parts. Okay. It cost $120,000 in their money in 1959, and so for all of the dollar values, I put it in today's dollars, like what the equivalent would be. It was $1 million for this mainframe computer. And they sold 55 of them. So that was the entire player base. For if you wanted to play Space War, there was 55 places that could play Space War. The system, like the computer, weighed 1,600 pounds. Okay, so not as portable as the Switch. Okay, so moving forward to 1964, this Rosen guy merges with service games in Hawaii. So Rosen in Japan merges with service games in Hawaii, and they have 6,000 jukebox locations throughout Japan, and they form a company called Sega. Because of the high cost of shipping, okay, so Sega made this game called Periscope. Periscope is a mechanical electronic game as opposed to a digital electronic game, okay? And I'll show you a video in a second of what that is. So you look through this viewfinder at ships that are like moving along, and you try to shoot them, and there's like sound effects and lights and stuff. But because it was so expensive to ship this thing from Japan to America to get it into the arcades, or at that time games rooms, the arcade owners would normally charge nickels for things, but this thing was so bloody expensive that they started charging quarters. And this is the moment where all coin-operated things become quarters. Okay? It's because of Sega Periscope. It's Japan's first amusement game export. The first video game, if you will, to come out of Japan. So here is a little video of what the heck is an electric mechanical game like. So that's the ship, and it's moving. Kablooey! Doesn't that look fun? I don't know, that looks pretty fun to me. One more. there you go. So that's the start of video games. Who's in shock? Yeah, it's crazy. Okay, so some guys that were playing Space War were like, hey, this Space War thing's like super fun. I wonder if we can get that into a games room or an arcade. And so they started working on trying to do that, trying to get a computer. It ended up costing $20,000 or something in order to have this thing, again, in their money. And it was just really crazy, cost prohibitive. So someone else kind of saw what they were doing, saw what Space War was, and they started working on a game called Computer Space. This is the first reskin, okay, of the industry and the IP violation and everything that is going on today. So he decides to make Computer Space, and instead of using a generic computer, like you have a computer in front of you that can do a lot of things, it can do word processing, it can do painting, it can do a lot of things. Instead of doing that, they just made hardware that was just enough hardware to run this game, okay? So that was like a new idea. It was like, oh, I thought I had to have a computer to run this thing. It's like, no, we'll just use ROMs in order to run the programs and stuff just for what we need. And so that dropped the cost from $20,000 to $100. So that was kind of a big innovation. This is the first coin-operated video game. It was the first widely available game of any type. And it had no CPU and no memory. And you just ran it. And so they sold 1,300 units, and they sold them for about $800, which today would be about $5,000. And so they got $1 million of revenue from this first game. And so I'll show you what it looks like. And that's enough of that. So it's basically Space War, right? It's just Space War done differently. Okay, so the guy who did that is this guy. His name is Nolan Bushnell. And Nolan Bushnell, in May 1972, founded a new company. And he follows me on Twitter. I was really happy the day that he decided to follow me. And the company that he started is anybody? Atari. Okay, so this is where Atari comes from. So that game you just saw was the birth of Atari. Okay, so early gaming, 1972 to 1978. Nolan Bushnell is an important guy in the history of video games, especially during these ages. So let's talk a little bit about him. So he took electrical engineering, and he worked part-time or like during summers at an amusement park close to where he was going to school. And at the amusement park, he saw people basically doing like skee ball and the claw thing and whatever. And he just saw people like putting quarters into these things, and he was like, I think there's something to this. Like, what if you could do more, like have some kind of game or something going on? So he saw that. The second thing is he's very entrepreneurial. Okay. He was a door-to-door salesman for encyclopedias, which is like boggles the mind to think that people did that, but that was something you could do, like go to door and sell encyclopedias. So that teaches you a lot of things. Teaches you how to be bold and go up to people's houses and ask them to buy encyclopedias. Teaches you salesmanship, like how to convince people to pay you hundreds of dollars for these encyclopedias. And it builds confidence and those kinds of things. He also built his own advertising company while in school. So think of it, like right now, like you're like, yeah, I'm gonna make an advertising company and start producing posters and billboards and stuff out of school. So my point is that there's a reason that this guy started video games, because engineers and unfortunately artists are usually too shy in order to go out and like do it, like actually do it, right? But this guy, the encyclopedia salesman, is like, yeah, I want to make money, like let's do this. And so the important thing is that if you're going to have a game, if you're going to have a successful game of any kind, you have to have this guy, a business guy, somebody who has the ideas, the salesmanship, the bravado in order to go out and sell the thing. Okay, so Nolan Bushnell, he's doing his thing. He's making his space war type game and his computer space. And elsewhere, there's a company called Magnavox. Magnavox was a maker of TVs. They don't exist anymore, but they made TVs like Sony, RCA, if you've heard of any of those companies, Samsung, just like them. So they're busy making TVs, and somebody in their R&D department decides to try and make something to connect up to the TV. Like, hey, what if we could maybe get some games onto the TV? So in 1972, there was a guy who had a patent for connecting a TV to some kind of gaming system. And so Magnavox says, wow, that's a pretty good idea. And they bought the patent from the guy. So now Magnavox owns it. And then they work on it, and they create this thing called the Odyssey. And they do private showings at certain trade show events in order to like drum up interest from retailers and that kind of stuff. So they start showing this. Well, one of the guys who saw this thing was Nolan Bushnell. Okay, now a little bit about this Magnavox. CPU doesn't have one. RAM doesn't have any. The media is ROM cartridges, and the price was $100, which is a pretty good price point to hit, especially for something early. So this is the first home console, Magnavox Odyssey. And so in today's money, it would cost you $600 for this thing. And they sold 350,000 of these things. And one of the first games they had was table tennis. Okay? So look at this screen. These are all the things that this system is able to draw at one time. They're able to draw 2 large blocks, 1 small block, and 1 line. Okay? So you're like, holy cow, what can I do with that? And I can tell you, they did a lot. They created table tennis, a skiing game, Simon Says, another tennis, not table tennis, regular tennis. Again, I'm not exactly sure how that's different, but and they're like, we need some graphics. So then in the box, they would give you these plastic sheets that would go over top of the television. And then when you're playing the game, then you have some graphics. Now, like, it's clearly a much funner game because you can see, where you are in context of, shooting the ball back and forth. And look at this awesome football game. I mean, it's obviously football at this point because there's the yard lines, right? Let's play some football. And then this next one is some kind of maze chase game, and it's like, okay, we got to get the light away from the other light and moving it around with the joystick. But that's not all. They also packed in accessories like play money and cards and stuff. So you would be playing this board game, and there would be like the TV determining some of the rules like that would happen, right? It's like, oh, this thing lit up, okay, now we all have to do this. And so you see the exact same thing today with board games that come with digital apps that provide ambient music or sound effects or rules. Like they say, they have a 30-second timer, and then the app tells you what the next thing is to do within the game. So everything that's new is something old, just different. On top of all this, they decided to make a gun. So they had a light gun for this awesome system, and this rifle that you would hold you would shoot at the bad guys. And so let's see how you can actually play this rifle game here. Oops. I think I thought that was a video. No, it's not a video. Okay, I'm just telling you. Okay, so what would happen is it would light up the window, and you would have to aim the gun and pull the trigger, and then you would get a point for hitting that. You can't actually see the points because they don't have any RAM to score your points. But you would know, hey, I got it, as opposed to I didn't. And so it would just light things up. Isn't that great? That's pretty great. So Nolan Bushnell sees this thing on display, and what does he do? He goes and he makes this game called Pong. And Pong is ping pong, right? And what he does with that is he makes this machine, and it has exactly what you saw. It was like 2 lines and 1 ball thing that can like move back and forth. And they build this thing, and they're like, I wonder if this is going to work. So they build the thing, they make a little prototype, right? And then there's this place called Andy Capp's Tavern that was down the street. And so they take this machine, put it into Andy Capp's Tavern, and tell them kind of how it works. And the thing wasn't even full size. They had to put it on a barrel so that it was high enough for people to play at it. And then they see like, okay, how does this go? So they're going along, and about 2 weeks go by, and the guy calls them up and says, hey, that thing that you put here is broken. You need to come and fix it. People seem to really like it, but now it's broken, so you need to fix it. Okay, so he goes down there, and he's like looking at it. It looks okay from the outside, and then he's like, okay, I'm gonna have to, turn it on and give myself free play. So he opens up the coin drawer, and quarters just come rushing out of the thing, and that's why it didn't work, is because it was so stuffed with quarters that it couldn't take any more quarters. You couldn't start a game. Okay, so they were like, oh, I think we're onto something. And he says, there's him in this book saying like, oh, that was an easy problem to solve. I like that problem, right? There was too much money in the system. So this guy found that with Pong in his bar, people were lining up in order to get into the bar when it opened at 2 p.m. And they were not coming for drinking. They were coming to play Pong against each other. It was a two-player only game, so you had to find someone else in order to play Pong with you, because again, there was no AI. The cost of the Pong machine was $1,200, and you had to pay up front. It cost Atari about $400 to build it, so that's a pretty nice spread on the $1,200. You made $800 per unit, and they sold 8,000 of them. And so it's like, holy cow, how am I going to build all these things? So Atari went from like building one machine to suddenly having to build like 1,000 of them, and they didn't have room. And so there was an old roller rink that was abandoned, and they like leased that, and then they didn't have employees, so they went down to like the Unemployment Canada kind of office and said, hey, send us everybody that you have. And so they sent everybody, and they had prostitutes and drug addicts, and they had homeless people, and everybody just showing up, and they taught them how to solder, and they taught them how to put a screen in, and how to put the cabinetry together for this thing. And there's all kinds of crazy problems, people shooting up heroin in the bathrooms, and the place smelled like pot all the time. It was total insanity. Okay, the fact that they actually got 8,000 of these things out the door is insane. But they did. And Magnavox saw this Pong and said, hey, that's ours, and sued Atari. And then they settled out of court. And so this is the infamous Pong. And by the way, this guy on the right really sucks at this game. The big innovation that they added to this over the table tennis of the Odyssey was if you hit it on the edge, like he just did there, it goes faster. And that one little mechanical change made the game way more strategic and interesting and created a risk-reward system and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so this is Pong. This is, it's not Computer Space. Computer Space was the first official arcade machine, but this is the one that blew up. This is the one that everybody knows, okay? Pong. Okay, so moving along to 1973, there's a couple of new businesses that enter into the market. They get founded. The first one is Taito, the second is Williams, and the third is Midway. That's all you need to know about that. Okay, next, does anybody know this guy? Zach, you know this guy?
Isn't that Gary Gygax?
Gygax, yes. Okay, so there's this guy in Wisconsin that is Lake Geneva. I think that's in Wisconsin. So he's at Lake Geneva, and he has this idea for making what he calls a role-playing game. It's a cooperative storytelling game. And that game is Dungeons & Dragons. And he created it to have something to play with his kids and something to play with his friends that he was really into miniature gaming with. Miniature wargaming was all the rage at this time in the 60s and 70s. And so he was like, hey, what if instead of the Civil War or Roman armies or medieval armies, what if there was magic and stuff? Kind of like Lord of the Rings. Like, what if we could do Lord of the Rings for these miniature games? And so he created that. The original thing was called Chainmail, and then Chainmail got moved into what is now Dungeons & Dragons. So he introduced a couple of things. One was the D20, the 20-sided dice. So that only exists because he decided that there would be a D20. Now, D20 is actually a really good mechanical device in a game because you can take percentiles. You take 100% divided by 20, it's 5%. So it's really easy in your head to say, oh, 55% chance, that's an 11 plus, right? It's just really easy. So That's where that comes from. So this came in 1974. In 1975, you have Namco. They begin making games, and Atari comes out with the home Pong unit. So this Pong thing is doing great in arcades. Interesting thing is that once they sell a Pong unit to an arcade, they don't buy another Pong unit. Like, the people who own the Pong unit are the ones making all the money from the change. Okay, but if you manufacture them for home, then everybody who plays Pong, you get a piece of that money. So it makes sense to do a home system. So they decide to make this home Pong unit. They talk to Sears about it, and they say to Sears, yeah, who should we talk to? And they're like, oh, it's like table tennis, so talk to the sporting goods guy. So the sporting goods becomes the place where they list the home Pong video game system. I don't know how you're supposed to find it in there, but that's it. So Sears ordered 150,000 units of this thing for Christmas. And Nolan didn't have the money to produce 150,000 units, right? So the way business works is, hey, here's my order for 150,000. So what do? You got to go find them. You don't get paid until you deliver them. So you have to go build them and then deliver them. And once you deliver them, then you get paid. And actually, you don't get paid. You get paid in 30 days. And actually, they don't pay in 30 days. They usually pay in 60 and 90 days, and maybe even 120 days. So you got this whole outlay of cash that you have to do for building the things, delivering them, and then hope for your money to come from Sears. So he runs out of money. And he goes to venture capitalists in order to get some funding from this guy named Don Valentine. And he becomes a famous guy in venture capitalism. And he gets the money from him. So Nolan no longer owns all of Atari. He just owns a majority of Atari at this point. And so these things sold for $100 through the Sears catalog at Christmas time. And they sold every single one of them, all 150,000. So that created $90 million of revenue for Atari in their first year. So it's pretty good to be them. Okay, so in 1976, on going to $90 million in revenue, Nolan decides to cash in and sells Atari to Warner Communications. Okay, so Time Warner, if you heard of them, Warner Brothers, okay, that's all part of the same conglomerate. So he sells to them for $28 million. Also, I was born, not nearly the impact on video games yet, but my story's not ended. Okay, this guy, his name is Steve Wozniak, and the short form for him is Woz. Everybody likes to call him Woz. And he's really smart hardware hacker, and he likes to make motherboards and integrated circuits and stuff. And so he had a job working at HP in order to make calculators. And those calculators, the way that you could make them cheaper is to use less chips. So if you use 10 chips, maybe it costs $20 to make. If you used 5 chips, then it costs $10 to make, right? So you want to reduce the number of chips. And this to him was like playing Candy Crush. It was a puzzle that he loved solving, and he would just do it all day long and try to figure that out. So he was really smart at electrical engineering, basically, okay? You couldn't go to school for this stuff, so you just learned it on your own. So he loved making electronic stuff, and he made friends with this other guy. And this other guy is Steve Jobs. So these are the two Steves. And Steve Jobs, he got a contract working at Atari. And Steve Jobs is this weird hippie guy that was into Buddhism, and he's vegetarian, and he wouldn't wear shoes. He would walk barefoot everywhere, and he was pretty smelly and long-haired and just a weird guy. And the guys at Atari are like, I don't want to work with Steve Jobs because he stinks. And so they put him on the night shift when most people weren't in the office. So Steve Jobs would come in and work on his video game. And his video game, you'll see in a second. So when Bushnell hires Steve Jobs and gives him this video game to make, he describes the game, and he says there's a certain number of integrated circuits or chips that you can use in order to make this game. So if you can do better than that, if you could do less chips, I'll pay you a $100 bonus for every chip less than, I think it was 50 that he told him he could have. His budget was 50 chips. And so Steve Jobs was like, oh, okay. And he really struggled with the design because, to be honest, Steve Jobs is not that great of an engineer. He's a much better business guy than he is as an engineer, but he knows enough. So he's working on it and stuff and really struggling with it. And he goes to his friend Woz and says, "Hey, Woz, can you help me out with this thing?" And Steve Woz, he's like the nicest guy you're ever going to meet. He's the kind of guy you want to hug every time you see him. So Steve Woz comes over to Atari and helps him with it and comes up with a circuit board design. And that circuit board design, his budget was 80 circuits. Steve Woz comes up with it to 30. And so Steve Jobs says, "Hey, I'll give you half of the bonus if you help me with this thing." And Woz is like, "Sure, no problem, Steve. I love helping people." And so he ends up doing 50 chips less. So 50 chips less is $5,000. So Nolan Bushnell pays $5,000 to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs goes to Steve Wozniak and says, "Yeah, they gave me $1,000, or $700 bonus. Here's your $350." And that tells you a lot about Steve Woz, and it tells you a lot about Steve Jobs in that one little story. The design that Steve Woz did on Breakout, like the chip design, was so good and efficient, nobody knew how to manufacture it. And so they actually had to redesign the board and use like 60 chips instead of his 30. So that's one of those ironies of history. And this is the game that he created, Breakout. Oh yeah, there's some guy blabbing in the background. Yes. So you can see it's different Pong, right? Everything moves in small steps. There are no giant leaps in games. And it has the same mechanic. If you get it on the edge, then it like goes faster and bounces at a special kind of angle depending on where it hits. Okay, that's enough of that. Okay, 1977 is a really big year in video game history. Shigeru Miyamoto joins Nintendo as an apprentice in the planning department. Okay, he had nothing to do with any games or anything. He's also the company's first artist. One of the most famous game designers on the planet started as an artist. Does that give you hope? Excitement? Who wants to be the next Miyamoto? Yeah! Nintendo releases this the first home video game system in Japan. Like this whole Pong thing at home or whatever, like none of that stuff got to Japan. So Nintendo releases this thing called the Color TV Game 6. That just sounds Japanese. Okay? Color TV Game 6. But more importantly, in North America, we have the release in 1977 of the Atari VCS. And also later renamed to the Atari 2600, and basically everybody calls it the Atari 2600. But technically it's called the Atari VCS. VCS stands for Video Cartridge System. Okay, so the CPU in this thing is 8 bits and 1.19 megahertz. Okay? It has 128 bytes of RAM. 128 bytes, not 128K, 128 bytes. As a programmer, that's insane as to like what you can store. So they have all kinds of weird tricks that they would do. Like they would use some RAM in order to display your score, and then when the displaying of the score processing was done, they would chuck it and then put in some AI for the opponent and stuff. It's like crazy stuff to try and make that work. The media was 2 kilobyte cartridge ROMs. Okay, you could never save your game. The price at the time was $199, so it's like it came out today for $800. And they sold 30 million of these things. This is a massive success. And just to give you a flavor of what the Atari 2600 games look like, this is Missile Command. That music is not the music of the Atari 2600. That somebody like layered that on. That's the music of the Atari 2600. Okay, that gives you an idea of what you're dealing with in terms of palette, in terms of the size of the pixels. Okay, the pixels are massive on this thing. Okay. Okay, still in the same year, in other news, there's this game that gets developed on the mainframe systems, again with like MIT, Computer Lab, that kind of thing, called Colossal Cave Adventure. And this is the first work of interactive fiction. And it's a text adventure game, and basically any adventure game that you see, any point and click adventure game and stuff, all comes back to this thing. It's got a 2-word text parser, so you would type like go north or pick up rock or something like that, okay? That's how the gameplay would be. And it was inspired by a local cave system that this guy would explore on his own, so a real cave system, and Lord of the Rings and D&D. He was trying to like mix all those things together, and so you would go through and explore, and you would find like magical treasure and weapons and stuff. Okay, and so the game was played. As you can see at the top, you are standing at the end of a road before a small brick building. Around you is a forest. A small stream flows out of the building and down a gully. And then you would do something with that. You would just like, I don't know, what can I do? And you just like start trying stuff, making up verbs and nouns and trying to figure out how to get further into the game. It also had a point system. So like if you find a piece of treasure, you would get something for that. If you overcame a particular monster, you would get something for that. And there were 350 points to the game. And so people became completionists. They would try to figure out how to get all 350. Have you ever heard of people doing that in WoW and achievements in, I don't know, Assassin's Creed, Spider-Man, whatever, right? So this is the beginning of that, completionists. The weird thing about it, the interactive fiction, is you couldn't actually draw out a map for it. Like the rooms were not in like 3D space or something, so they didn't actually connect up correctly. So you would start mapping this thing, and then you're like, wait a minute, I went south, then I went east, then I went north, then I try to go east, and it doesn't connect up. Like, what the heck, right? And so anyway, there's like all these impossible maps that people have drawn of this thing. It later got re-released in a graphic text adventure. Ooh, look at that. It's much more advanced, okay? Now you have a nice 4-color graphics. Can you imagine working in that with your Wacom tablet? You got like 4 colors. Black counts as one of the colors, okay? Yeah, so anyways, this Colossal Adventure was re-released later for DOS and IBM and stuff. Okay, so let's go back to these 2 Steve guys. You remember them from not too long ago? They decided to get together and made this thing in 1976, and they didn't really know what to call it. It was a computer, and at that time there was this other computer, the Altair. Okay, this is my shirt. Now, because of what I taught you in hardware, you can read what my shirt actually says. Programming is as easy as 0, 1, 2. So the Altair computer was this kit that you could order for $400, and then you could assemble it. And if you soldered it correctly, and if you put it all together nicely, then you had a computer. And Woz made a computer that was easier to put together and better and more powerful, whatever. And so they decided to make this computer, and they're like, what are we going to call it? So Steve Jobs says, let's call it the Apple. So they call it the Apple. And then he decides to put a price on it, and he sells it for $666.66. Why is that? One was basically a big FU to everybody, but the other reason is it cost them about $500 in order to make this, and a 1/3 markup on $500 is $666.66. So that's how they ended up with that. And so they sold 50 of these units, and they were going to make $25,000 for selling 50 of these packages, but they had to buy all the parts, and that required $20,000, and they didn't really have $20,000, but they managed to kind of scrape the money together and get this thing going, and they managed to sell this Apple computer. And so there was a retailer in the what's now Silicon Valley area. I mean, it wasn't at that time, but there was a store there that was buying these things and reselling them, and he's like, hey, Steve, it would be a lot easier to sell these things if they were already put together. And so that got him thinking, maybe people would want a computer that they don't have to solder together themselves. And so in 1977, they created the Apple II. And the Apple II was the first computer that you could buy in a store that was already assembled. I know that sounds remarkable, but it was already assembled for you. It had an 8-bit processor running at 1 megahertz, so actually slower than the Atari 2600, which is a little weird. 4K of RAM, way more than your Atari 2600, which had 128 bytes. And the media was floppy disks. It also had cassette tapes, but very quickly they moved from cassette tapes to floppy disks, which could store 140K, which at that time was like all the space in the world. And that sold for $1,300 in 1977. So that's about $5,300 today. You could also get this thing upgraded to 48K of RAM, so 10 times the RAM, and that would cost you about another $1,000 in order to get that much more RAM. And so how many of these things did they sell? They sold about 5 to 6 million of these. This is one of the most popular computers on the planet, and especially at this time. Okay? The biggest thing about the Apple II was you could make your own games. Okay, so up until this point, like the Atari 2600, it's like, yeah, that's great, I can play games, whatever, but I can't do anything else with it. Whereas with this computer on your desk, I could maybe make my own game, and a lot of people did. So a lot of game designers that got started with the Apple II. And this is a little video of Apple II games. Look at Arkanoid versus the Breakout. There's the first Castle Wolfenstein. There's one of the first point-and-click adventure games. Mystery House is an important one. Okay, you get the idea. Big jump in terms of the capabilities of like the Atari 2600. The computer is really rivaling what you see in the arcade at this point. And this actually stays true for most of video game history. What you can get on your computer is generally better or the same as what's available in the arcade. Okay, so any questions on this early part? Computers, arcade machines? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now we move into the Golden Age. Why is it called the Golden Age? Well, we start in 1978 there at the coin-op revenue in US millions, so 308 million is what people are making at coin-op arcades. Then it jumps to 1979, 968, then that jumps to 2.8 billion, and then in 1981, it's almost 5 billion. That's crazy growth curve for an industry, right? This is insane. The only thing that rivals this is smartphones. So, something happened in 1981. Anybody like to take a guess? Commodore 64? No. I think it's the following year, 82. But that's a good guess. But this is coin-op, specifically. Coin-op. Any guesses as to what game came out in 1981? Yep.
Pac-Man?
Pac-Man. Did you Google that?
No.
Okay, good. Good guess, yeah. Pac-Man brought in female gamers. And so that jump, almost doubling of revenue, $2 billion, is women showing up and playing arcade games too. Okay, so 1978, Nolan Bushnell. Nolan Bushnell gets forced out of his own company that he started at Atari, right? He had already sold, but he was still working there, and he had a contract, he was working there. And so he got kicked out. And at this time, he had a couple things going on in his head. The first thing was, these Warner Brothers guys that own Atari are a bunch of yahoos. They have no idea how to run a video game company. And so he actually, on his way out, decided to short the stock. Shorting a stock is different from buying a stock and waiting for it to go up in value. So you buy it at $100, you wait for it to go to $200, and then you sell it and you make $100. Shorting a stock is the opposite of it. It's where you say to someone, hey, I'll sell you a stock at $100 right now, and then I'll buy it and actually give it to you later. Okay? It's a much riskier proposition to do, but it's a way that you can make money when stocks go down. Okay? So if I say, I'm going to sell you a stock today at $100, and you're like, oh, that's pretty good, that's fair value, $100, and I'll give it to you in 3 months. Then 3 months go by, the stock's $25, I buy it for $25, I already sold it to you for $100, and I make $75 clean, right? That's how you short a stock. So Nolan Bushnell is like, hey, these guys are a bunch of idiots, they're only going to lose money, so he shorts the stock as he leaves. He made $28 million selling the company to Warner Brothers, and then made another $20 million when he got kicked out, shorting the stock and guessing that they're going to ruin it. So I think that's great. Second thing is, he's like, hey, I got all these arcade machines, and you know what would be great is if we had like a fun family place where you could go and have a slice of pizza and have birthday parties, and you could play video games. That obviously makes a lot of sense if you're Atari making all the machines. And so he creates this thing called Pizza Time. And so Pizza Time, he's got like a couple locations. So part of him leaving the company, he gets a contract saying, I want the rights to Pizza Time. And the Atari people owned by Warner Brothers are like, I could care less about this Pizza Time thing. That's a dumb idea. And so they're like, sure, here you go. Here's your rights to Pizza Time. And he renames Pizza Time into Chuck E. Cheese. Yeah, so that's how Chuck E. Cheese came to be. So Nolan Bushnell, he's an important dude. He's affected your life if you've ever had a birthday party there. Okay, so yeah, I'll move on from that. Okay. Also, in 1978, this guy, Scott Adams, created the first text adventure game. So I told you briefly about him because he's a guy that I know. And he made the first one and then made about 13 more to make the set and built a company and sold millions of units, and it was all great. In 1990, they were interviewing a game designer, and he said that it was impossible to design new and more difficult adventure puzzles because Scott Adams has already created all of them in his early games. So he's an important guy in adventure games. Okay, also this year, this game came out. Space Invaders. There's a lot of innovations that took place in this particular game. You're looking at it going, what the heck? You see the lives down below? That was new. That had never existed before. Like you put a quarter in, that you just played with what you had, that one life. The defenses that are there. The pattern of the guys moving and getting closer. The heartbeat type sound that gets except when there's a UFO. The heartbeat type sound that gets faster and faster as they get closer and closer to the bottom. So creating an audio experience that actually has a physiological effect on the player. Okay, that's enough Space Invaders. Okay, so some of the firsts. So multiple lives. Oh, and the gaining of lives, getting a certain number of points. It was the first game to ever reward you a life for getting a certain number of points. Targets that shot back. So up until this point, there were just things to shoot, and that was it. They never shot at you, but now you actually have to dodge. And yeah, that was new. The first background music. The first tracking of high scores. Okay, so you would play on the machine, you would get a high score, and then you would put in your initials, and then somebody else would come and play, and they would beat your high score, and so then they would be first, and you would be second on the list. Okay, and that was crazy. Like nobody had ever seen that before, and now it became a competition to prove how good you were at Space Invaders, and you would make the rounds. You would go to the one at the pizza place, and you'd play that until you had the top score on there, and then you go one to the convenience store, and then you would play that one until you got the top score on there, and then the next day you start making the rounds, you go to the pizza place, what? So-and-so beat me? I can't believe it. So you play the thing like crazy in order to get on the top score. Okay, so what do we call that today? Yeah, but specifically this high score thing. No. Comparing high scores, keeping them around. Leaderboards. Leaderboards. Space Invaders was the first game to have a leaderboard. And now we're copying it. It's like a new thing in mobile and even VR games have leaderboards and stuff. I have 2 VR games where I sort of compete against the leaderboard. I mean, I'm not 14 years old, so I don't have all kinds of time in order to play it. But yeah, leaderboards comes from Space Invaders. Okay, the cost of this thing was $1,700, and it would earn $300 to $400 a week. This was insane, okay? Space Invaders is mammoth. So how many of these would you buy if you're an arcade owner? It's give me 5. I want to make $2,000 a week, right? Why not? This thing pays for itself in 5 weeks, basically. And you get to own it forever. So that's pretty amazing. They sold 300,000 Space Invaders. Now, if you remember, Pong sold 8,000 arcade units, and that was a smash hit. So this thing took over the planet. It's crazy how big Space Invaders was. The Japan Mint had to triple production of the 100 yen piece because they were all jammed into Space Invader machines. There was not enough money in circulation because of Space Invaders. That's insane. Best-selling and highest-grossing entertainment product at the time, so bigger than anything else, like movies or whatever, right? It's the biggest thing ever. And the many versions of the game are estimated to have grossed over $13 billion in total as of 2016. So that's remakes and licensing and stuff. So Grand Theft Auto 5 is not even close to the size, the impact of Space Invaders on video gaming. 1979, Capcom is founded. Sierra is founded. Also, this guy named Warren Robinette, he would make games for the Atari 2600. So just to paint this picture, so you have Atari, and they have 2 divisions. They have the division that's making the home systems, so they would call that Atari Computer, and then they would have Atari that makes the arcade machines. Okay, so the people that made the games for the home system did not make the games for the arcades, and vice versa. Okay, so this guy's busy making an adventure game, and he decides that he's kind of bitter about the fact that Atari refuses to put names of creators on boxes. Okay, so if you're a musician and you write a song, you get credit. If you make a movie and you're in it or you direct it, you get a credit. But if you make a video game, no one will ever hear of you ever. Okay, that's the rule, that coming from Warner Brothers. So he decides to put in this thing where if you go into a certain room, a certain number of times, you go in, out, in, out, in, out, in, out, you do that a certain number of times, then you can go into a secret room, and in that secret room is his name, created by and his name. Okay, and this is the very first Easter egg ever put into a game. Okay, also this year, in the arcade division, is Asteroids. Now the thing that you can't see from watching this video is the vector graphics display of Asteroids. So it's a screen that has like lasers behind it that are shooting into your eye, and it's super bright and crisp. I don't know if you've seen like a pen laser or something like that, like on a wall, like it's super bright and crisp. That's how this display would be. Like this just looks like, whatever, you got some things. But the brightness of this display was like so impressive. It was just cool to look at. Yes, it's only black and white, but space is black, so that's pretty good. But the screen looked amazing at this time. Okay, so that's Asteroids, and it's like super fun. You still play it today, it's super fun. Okay, so this vector holographic display was a big deal. We sold 70,000 units. Now, compared to Space Invaders, like nothing comes close to Space Invaders, but back to like reality here, where selling like 30,000, 50,000, like Asteroids is a big deal. Okay, so in people's minds, like in the arcades, it displaced Space Invaders for popularity, so that was important. And it earned 500 million in coin drops, like a quarter at a time. That's insane. Asteroids with Space Invaders displaced pinball machines. So all the way up until this point, you would go into an arcade, it'd be mostly pinball machines and then some arcade machines, video game machines. And at this point, people wanted to play the video game machines and they were less interested in the electromechanical pinball machines. Okay, so then what happens is this game comes out in 1979. We have Galaxian. Now look at this thing versus Space Invaders. This thing's crazy advanced. So different patterns for how they come at you, right? It's not the same pattern. Look at the background. It has a scrolling background. That's never been done before. Look at the colors. There's so many colors. It's got better sound effects. It's got cooler explosions. So Namco's Galaxian has RGB color, which was amazing. I just said the AI thing, background. Way more difficult than Space Invaders. Okay, so this is something that everybody's concerned about. It's like, hey, people are getting really good at Space Invaders, and now it's not really challenging anymore. And so Namco's like, I gotcha. Okay, I'm going to make like the hardest thing in the world to play. And so if you were to go back and play this, like now, you would like it would destroy you. Like you have no chance of playing this game. Pardon?
I've played that one before.
And? Yeah, it's crazy hard. Okay, video games have gotten way easier over the years. But part of the reason was you had millions of teens that had been trained on Space Invaders, and they were looking for that next fix, right? And so that's what Galaxian was. So they sold 40,000 units, which is a big deal. Okay. Also in 1979, we have the Mattel Intellivision comes out. And it has a 16-bit processor. This is the first 16-bit processor at home with 2 megahertz. Look at that speed. That's awesome. 1 kilobyte of RAM. That's pretty good. It has 6 kilobyte cartridge ROMs. And the price is $299. So it's a little bit more expensive than the Atari 2600. Sells for $890 today. It has about 1,000 times more memory than the Atari 2600, which is its direct competitor. Okay? So basically they came out with way better hardware to go up against Atari. And they had really good graphics because of it. And they sold 3 million units. And so here's a tiny video to show you some of the games on the Intellivision. So if you remember what 2600 looked like this is pretty mind-blowing. Look at this baseball. Look at the animation in that pitch. That's incredible. Okay, everybody's blowing their minds. They're like, look at this thing. We don't have to take plastic and stick it on top of our TVs anymore to get some graphics. Okay, so in 1980, some important things happen. First of all, Space Invaders came out for the Atari 2600. There's a couple of firsts that come with this. It was a big licensing agreement between Taito and Atari, and it was the first cartridge to break 1 million units sold. Okay, so it's the first 1 million unit seller. Eventually, they sold 2 million. This is the first arcade port. Okay, it probably doesn't make any sense. Like, what the heck? Like, you have this division making arcade games, you have this division making home console games, and the idea was like, yeah, those are different things. Those are different kinds of customers. And so this is the first time they're like, wait, what? The thing in the arcade can actually be sold at home? That's an amazing idea. And so it's the first port. It also became the first killer app for a console system. So up until this point, there was like, yeah, there were games, but this was the game that everybody wanted for their Atari 2600. Once they released Space Invaders, sales of the Atari 2600 quadrupled. 4 times the number of units sold because of this game. It's crazy. So this is where your Mario, Sonic, Halo comes from. It comes from Space Invaders moving units of the 2600. Now every single business guy is like, hey, that's how you do a system. And this on the left is the arcade version, and the one on the right is the 2600 version. And they look pretty close. Like, this is a pretty good port, considering the hardware that you're working with and such. Okay? And it was Space Invaders that really kept arcades alive at this time, kept things going. Now, as I told you, there were guys that were working at Atari on games, and they weren't allowed to put their name on it. They just didn't feel like they were getting credit. And so like there was like this memo that came out that said, hey, here's the 20 top selling games for the Atari 2600. And since these are the top selling games, whatever your new game idea is, make it like one of those. Okay, so this is like, hey, make another Halo, make another Grand Theft Auto or whatever. Just make it like these. And the guy's looking at the memo and he's like, they sold like 500,000 units of this thing. They sold 500,000 units of this thing. They sold 500,000 units of this thing. And I designed all of them. It was one guy who did it. And it takes about a year to make an Atari 2600 game. And he's like, I'm getting paid $20,000 a year, and they're getting 20 million, 50 million, $100 million off of my work. Like, I don't think this is fair. So he, David Crane, and a couple of other people went to management and said, we don't think this is fair. We think there should be some kind of royalty or something that you share with the designers. Okay? And Warner Brothers said, screw you, get out of my face. And they said, fine, screw you, we're going to go take our ball and bat and we're going to go make our own thing. And they created a new company, the very first third-party game developer. Okay? So up until this point, Intellivision games come from Intellivision programmers. Atari 2600 games come from Atari programmers. This company says, you know what, we're just going to make games, and we're going to make them for any platform that we can think of. And that company is, anybody want to take a guess? One guess? Somebody? To make it more exciting? Yes? These 3 guys left and created a company called PlayStation? Okay, that unfortunately was a bad guess. Activision. Okay, so Activision came to be by being disgruntled game developers at Atari. Okay, next is this game called Battlezone, and this was a big deal at the time. I mean, it didn't sell a ton of units, but this is important for history. You got amazing 3D graphics. When you look at this screen, you can see there's like stuff going on at the top. That is separate from the main screen, okay? Trying to make a more like immersive experience of what it'd be like to be inside of a tank. And these vector 3D graphics were like amazing with the level of animation that they had, right? Because you didn't have hand animation at this time. And so this thing really created the feeling of being there. So this is what it looks like. And there's a periscope, basically, that you go and you put your face up into, right? And you look in this thing, and it's like all you see is what you were just seeing, like what's going on. And I did have a gap on the side so that observers, like your friends or whatever, could like see you, like what you were playing and what was going on. But putting your face into the viewfinder was thing. So this is the first-person perspective 3D graphics game. considered the first virtual reality experience because it's essentially a headset and you can't turn your head, right? But it's giving you that straightforward kind of 3D virtual reality feel. And it had 2 sticks, like a real tank. So you had real tank controls, and that was like innovative. So the American military saw this thing and said, hey, that looks really great. Let's make a tank simulator out of this thing for the Army. And the guy who designed this game was a real pacifist type, and he's like, screw you, I'm not doing that. And then Atari's like, yeah, you have to. And he's like, okay. And so then he made it, and then he felt really bad about it. This thing sold 13,000 units. So like it wasn't like a huge seller, but it really like moved the market forward. A lot of designers were influenced by this thing. Okay, next we have Williams Defender. There's no assignment for today. Your homework is watching all this. Okay, so you can see how the map is scrolling, right? Like he's flying right. You can fly left as well. And you see the mini map up at the top. There, see now he's going the other way? That just blew everybody's mind. They're like, what? What? Like you just saw Space Invaders. Space Invaders, like the whole thing's on one screen. Galaxian, whole thing on one screen, right? Like everything is tied to the boundaries of the screen. And then this guy comes along with his crazy Defender, and suddenly you're scrolling the screen. This is insane. So this becomes Williams' best-selling game. It's the first horizontal scrolling game, going forwards and backwards. The first multiple goal game. So what you have is people playing Galaxian and Space Invaders, and they're really good at those things. And so the feeling is, I think they're ready for something more. So in Defender, there are aliens that are coming down and picking up humans and trying to take them back to their homeworld. Okay? And you as a player are trying to avoid the aliens, you're trying to shoot the aliens, and you're trying to protect the people. That's like 3 goals simultaneously, right? So we just talked about core dynamics. Like there's a lot going on in this particular game. And so this normally as a game design would have been shot down, as a designer, like, hey, that's too complicated for players. But now they're like, hey, actually we can explore these like multifaceted goals within a game. So it's the first one to do that. It's the first game with a mini-map, so if you're playing Call of Duty or Halo or something, you have mini-maps because of this guy. This guy, Jarvis, is considered one of the top designers. This sold 55,000 units. Like I said, it was their biggest selling thing. Yeah. Okay, so switching over to the computer world again, there's this thing called Rogue that gets created on a mainframe computer. And Rogue is... you look at the screen like that, and it's a series of procedurally generated dungeons, like rooms, tunnels, and you can actually see them, right? So you saw the previous thing with Adventureland, like it was just text, and you just do it in your head, and now you can actually see it on the screen. And you play as this @ symbol in the center, and you are able to like move around in it. Rogue introduced the concept of permadeath. So you create a character, you get some equipment, you're going along, and then suddenly you die, and that's it. It's like, what? I don't get to save my progress? Or like, no. Permadeath is the big thing it's known for. The second thing is procedural map, treasure, and monster encounter generation. Like, which rooms have which monsters? I don't know. Even if I'm the designer, I can't tell you. I don't know. And so this has influenced a lot of game design now. So no game is the same. It's turn-based. Right? So very different from Space Invaders, right? So you are making decisions, and when you move, then the monsters move. Then you can move again, then the monsters move. He tried to combine Colossal Cave with D&D. Everybody's trying to do something with D&D, okay? Most video game history is people trying to do stuff with D&D. So it was made at the school and then was later published professionally in 1980 by Epix. And here is a really tiny video. And this guy likes to blab a lot. But basically, you start in the starting room. There's an S there. The S is a snake. And as he's moving, the snake is following him. And now he's choosing to equip a weapon. Here's how you equip a weapon. So he chose which thing to equip. Then he attacked the snake. He got an excellent hit. The snake died. Now he's going to go and get that pile of gold. So he got 12 gold pieces. Then I skipped him going down the dead end. And so now he's exploring, and it has line of sight. and is, you enter into the room and then it shows you what the room is, and it's hard to describe just how much fun this was, being the first time where the levels are not set. Okay, the levels are not set. Now, over in arcade land, as we already identified, we have this little known game called Pac-Man. Have you played Pac-Man? Who's played Pac-Man? That's crazy, right? This thing comes out in 1980, and people are like, oh yeah, I totally played Pac-Man, right? Pac-Man has endurance, okay? So you got to avoid those ghosts. Pick up the bonus cherries. Then you got to get those power pellets, which they're not doing. This guy's pretty good. Okay, that's Pac-Man. Okay, so Namco Pac-Man is insane. It comes out in 1980, but like it gets this big rush in 1981, right? It was originally called Puck-Man, and that really didn't sound so good in English, so they decided to change it to Pac-Man. The guy very specifically sat down and said, I'm going to make this game for women. I don't see women in the arcades. What would they like? He designed this game as to, I think this is what women would like. And it worked. That's the shocking thing in this. Like, a dude sat down to make a game for women, and it worked. And they started coming in the arcades. It was inspired by a pizza slice. So he's like working on the game. I don't know what the main character should be. He took a slice of pizza out, and he's like, there it is. That's what it should be. And the game should be about eating. So it makes sense that he's a pizza slice. It launched the maze chase genre. That became a whole genre unto itself. And I'm not going to dive into that genre because it's really kind of died out. But that was like a really big thing. And this is the first video game mascot character to hit big. Okay, so you've been in like, I don't know, a convenience store or some kind of store and you see like an Angry Bird plushie or something like that. Pac-Man made that happen. Pac-Man is the one that people buying plushies and putting them in their cars or whatever. Okay, so remember, hits in the arcade would sell about 50 or 60,000 units. This thing sold 300,000. This is like astronomical. It's at the same level of Space Invaders. It's just ridiculous how much people love Pac-Man. Okay, Pac-Man's going like crazy. Okay, so that moves us to 1981. And this is the state of the console market. Okay, you have Atari, which has 65% of the market, and television has 20%. And television got in recently, right? Atari's created it, basically. And then you have the other 15% with like various other things that don't really matter that much. These are the Atari console sales, okay? So I showed you a graph before of coin-op arcade. These are the consoles. So in 79, 119 million, then 200, and then blammo, like what the heck happened in 1981? Like this is crazy. We're at 800 million in sales, okay? Time Magazine, this article, just to be technical and academic, came out in 82, but it was written in 81 about everything that happened in 81. So that's why I threw it here into 81. 20 billion quarters have been spent in the last year. 75,000 man years played. 24,000 full arcades. Okay, so that's a retail space dedicated just to being an arcade. 400,000 street locations. So that's like your convenience store or pizza place or something like that. 1.5 million arcade machines. 5 billion in sales. So that's as much as all the Las Vegas, Nevada casinos combined. Video games are pulling in more money than that. That's crazy. 2 times as much as the movie industry, 3 times as much as baseball, basketball, football. At the same time, 1981, this magazine came out. It's the very first video game magazine. So somebody thought that would be a good idea. People would want to read up about games, and so this came to be. And then, though this didn't have much of an impact at this time, this is when it came out, so the IBM PC. So the computer you use today is based on this sucker, the IBM PC 5150. And its CPU is an 8-bit 4.77 megahertz. So this is actually the fastest thing that you can get at home. The RAM 16K, that's lots of memory, way more than the Apple II. The media was 160K disks that through some advancements were able to be double-sided, and they got to 360K on the 5.25-inch discs, and it sold for $1,500. Within 2 years, this thing outsold the Apple II. So all the Apple IIs that have been sold since '77, this thing surpassed them. And they sold about 3 million of this specific unit. But of course, like there's lots of other IBM or IBM compatibles and stuff, and that's what like took off at home. Very quickly, Atari Tempest came out. It was the first color vector graphics. So Asteroids had the first black and white vector graphics, and this one had the first color ones. It was the first game to have what they called skill steps. So when you went up to the game and you went to play, it would ask you, do you want to start levels 1 to 5, 5 to 10, or 10 plus? The options that were available to you for choosing where you started was actually based on the last play. So if you didn't do well enough, then those new options wouldn't be open to you. And so that was a big first. And it was the first game with progressive level design. So Space Invaders, Pac-Man, it was the same level, maybe just faster or something. But in this case, the levels were actually different between each level. So they would look different, they would play different, and that was a big deal. Also, very quickly, Namco came out with a sequel to Galaxian called Galaga. It's considered one of the best games in this golden age of arcade games. And one of the reasons is, you see that tractor beam there, the tractor beam could actually suck up your guy, okay? So if you got caught in the tractor beam, it would suck it up, and then you would lose a life, and then your next ship would come out, and then if you could kill that enemy, you would get your ship back, and then you'd have two of you going along the bottom, and it's like, what, this is insane, and it just blew everybody's minds, right? And so this was really cool at the time. Okay, this next one, Atari Centipede, came out also in '81, and it was co-created by a woman. And that's the first arcade machine co-created by a woman. And it turned out 50% of the players were women on Centipede. And she designed it saying, yeah, I don't like bugs, so I don't care about fighting aliens, but I like killing bugs, right? So that's why the theme is killing bugs, shooting spiders and centipedes and just icky things like that. And so this thing really took off. Also in '81, developed by Konami, this game Frogger. Frogger is, you have a little frog at the bottom, there's oncoming traffic, you have to get past traffic, then you have to jump on lily pads and logs, and then eventually make it into one of those safe spots at the end. So it was developed by Konami, but ported to home computers by Sierra, and Sierra sold 3 million console cartridges across the various home systems. So this was a huge seller. But most importantly, this is again, why are we studying history? Because it's this game. Like this game just totally ripped Frogger in every possible way, and then threw in like the unlocking of bunnies and Disney characters and like all that kind of stuff. Okay, so why would you, as a designer, study history? So you can rip off the ideas. That's really what it is. Like, just grab one of these games I talked about and just make a better version of it today. And these guys at Hipster Whale made their game in 12 weeks. I'm still working on my game after 5 years. They made their game in 12 weeks, and they've made $10 million. And yeah.
What's that game called again?
Crossy Road?
Yeah, I played that so much.
Yeah. Yeah, you're just playing Frogger with different graphics, voxel graphics. Okay. Next, we have Donkey Kong. And Donkey Kong is super important because it basically puts Nintendo on the map. So look at this. When you start the game, Donkey Kong starts climbing up the thing, and then he starts modifying the levels. Like, what? What is this insanity? This is your very first cutscene in a video game. Okay? It's telling a story. Very first game to have a story and have a cutscene. Okay, people love Donkey Kong. Created by Shigeru Miyamoto. Okay, he's a famous guy. How did it become Donkey Kong? Because it was named in Japanese, and then he was looking up stubborn gorilla in the Japanese to English dictionary, and stubborn, donkey, and gorilla Kong, that's how it became Donkey Kong. Okay, that's where that came from. Introduced the character Jumpman. Okay, that was his name. Later renamed to Mario. First game to have storyline. First game to have storyline before programming. So he sat down and wrote out what this thing was going to be, and then started programming. It's the first time that ever happened. Before that, they would sit down, they would make a game, and they're like, I don't know, what's the story to this? I don't know, there's aliens or whatever, right? They just like come up with something. Okay, so first time that's happened. First game to have cutscenes, I already mentioned that. First time to have multiple stages to a level. So you would have level 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, then 1, 4, and then the cycle would begin again. So that's a big deal. First platformer, where you are jumping over stuff. This is where it comes from. And they sold 67,000 units. And this brings us 1982, our last year, and there's a bunch of stuff that goes down in 1982. Atari comes out with the Atari 5200. Okay, so they've been selling this 2600 thing since about 76, 77, and they come out with this thing. It's got an 8-bit, 1.79 megahertz processor, 16K of RAM, 32K cartridge. That's a lot. And they price it at $269, so very aggressively priced against the Intellivision. And they sold 1 million units of this thing. Not anywhere close to what they wanted to sell for this thing. They were the first ones to have a start and pause button on their controller. You can see you could plug in 4 controllers at the front of this thing. Okay, who got that idea? GameCube. It's one of the first ones. N64, sorry, had the first 4-port thing in the modern era. Big problem with this thing, no backwards compatibility. So whatever Atari 2600 cartridges you have, sorry, you can't play those. You got to buy all new 5200 cartridges. So what are people supposed to do? So, oh, you like playing Donkey Kong? Great, go buy a 5200 version of Donkey Kong. You like playing Asteroids? Great, go buy a 5200 version of Asteroids. So they spent all their software time creating remakes, HD upgrades of their original catalog. Okay, so you can imagine, like, why the heck am I buying this system? There's like no compelling reason to get this thing. Also in 1982, the ColecoVision came out. And these guys were super smart. It's an 8-bit 3.58 megahertz system, so this thing's twice as fast as the 5200. 16K video memory, that's video memory, and then they have 1K of main memory. So this is the first time you see basically a GPU coming on a console. 32K cartridge ROMs, sells for $175. So it's a lot cheaper than the Intellivision and the 5200. And they sold 2+ million of these things. Now, they had 2 secret weapons that enabled them to outsell Atari. The first secret weapon was, this is the Atari 2600 Donkey Kong on the left, and this is Donkey Kong on the ColecoVision. And this thing was a platform seller. Actually, it was a pack-in. It was the very first pack-in game to go with the console. And so everybody was crazy about Donkey Kong in the arcade. They licensed Donkey Kong from Nintendo in order to have the home rights. And they paid $5 million to Nintendo to have these rights. And they made $153 million off of the cartridges. So this thing was insane. The second thing they did that was super smart for marketing the system was to have an Atari 2600 compatibility add-on. So you had this big fat thing that shoved into your ColecoVision, and now the whole catalog is available. So imagine buying your PS5, and it's like, oh, by the way, it's Xbox One compatible and PS4 compatible. It's like, what? That's insane, right? So it's crazy that you could play all of the competitors' games. And so the ColecoVision sold $500 million worth of ColecoVisions in 1 year. Like, it was crazy. Remember those guys that founded Activision? They created this thing called Pitfall. So a bunch of disgruntled programmers created this massive hit called Pitfall.
Pitfall is a graphically stunning game that is taking the VCS jungle by storm. The game is comprised of 255 different jungle scenes laid out horizontally.
255. Why? Because it's 8-bit. That's the most levels you could possibly get.
Within each are certain dangers and obstacles to avoid or overcome as Harry searches for 32 treasures.
So this cartridge sold 4 million copies. It's the biggest selling thing on the Atari 2600 to date. So Atari's kind of feeling bad about letting those guys go and not giving them some kind of royalty. It also defined your Metroid Castlevania type play style of having like multiple screens, going back and forth, picking up something somewhere, going somewhere else and utilizing it. It also created jungles as a theme. And where do we see jungles? Tomb Raider, Uncharted. That's where it comes from Pitfall. I felt remiss if I didn't mention Dig Dug. Dig Dug's a great game. That's all I can say about that. Pardon?
I played that one too.
All right. It's super fun. It's a great game, but I'm not going to say anything more about it. Q*bert comes out in 1982, and Q*bert is the first action puzzle game. So it does have action, like you have to use joystick in order to jump around with the timing, but it is a puzzle. You're trying to make all of these cubes a certain color, and then there's enemies that are turning them back, and so you're trying to figure out the best way in which to do that. One of the first isometric games, and they sold 25,000 units. But that doesn't really convey how much of a culture impact Q*bert had. This does, by having lunch pails and Pez dispensers and all kinds of stuff. Like everybody just fell in love with Q*bert. So everything that happened for Pac-Man is now happening for Q*bert. Okay, Midway has Mrs. Pac-Man. 1982 is just chock full of all kinds of stuff. So Ms. Pac-Man, she changes names a bunch of times, so Ms. or Mrs. Pac-Man, it started as a mod. There's a bunch of hackers that were like, hey, this is cool, this Pac-Man, but what if we made a better Pac-Man? So they started modding it and making a better Pac-Man, started selling the kits. Midway found out about that and said, hey, you can't do that. That's a violation of blah, blah, blah. But actually, this mod you made is like really cool, so let's buy it from you. And so that's how Ms. Pac-Man came to be. 4 major changes. They have 4 different mazes, different warp tunnels, and less predictable AI. And those 3 things caused Ms. Pac-Man to be like superior to regular Pac-Man. And everybody, this is the one everybody like loved, even though everybody remembers regular Pac-Man. They sold 150,000 units of Mrs. Pac-Man. So you already have 300,000 Pac-Mans out there, and then you have 150,000 Mrs. Pac-Mans right beside it. Okay, next we have the Sinclair, and just for the sake of time, I'm just going to blow through this thing. They sold 5 million of these things. It came out in England, and it was really cheap. Like, it was $220, and you could have this computer that did way better graphics than ColecoVision or anything. And anybody who's coming out of the English video game system, companies like Rare, Shiny, whatever, they all got their start on this thing, this Sinclair. And this is a cool video of what the Sinclair looks like, but I'm going to skip that. Because this is the really important one. This is when the Commodore 64 comes out. And what's the big deal? This is essentially the iPad of its time. Like, this thing just revolutionized homes, and everybody needed to have one and started working on it. Had an 8-bit 1 megahertz processor, but the big thing was the 64K of RAM. With the 64K of RAM, you could do a whole lot. Had floppies, and it came in at $595. So you remember what the IBM, it's like $1,500. The Apple II came out at like $1,250, and then this thing comes out and smokes them both, and it is only $595. So that's amazing. They sold between 12 and 17 million of these computers. That's crazy. Personally, the thing that really blew me away was when I went to my friend's house and he had this game Ghostbusters on his Commodore 64, and I would turn it on and it talked. Like, it just blew my mind. What? A video game could talk? Like, we just had beeps and bloops, which you've already heard so far, and here is a game that actually can talk. These are some of the some of the Commodore 64 graphics. They had a large color palette, so things can actually look quite different. I mean, look at this thing. This looks incredible. It's better than the arcade. So this thing blew everybody's mind. And I'll just skip through that. So these are the studios that the Commodore 64 built. Like, these guys really made their hits on Commodore 64, and this is what got them going. Okay, so EA, Accolade isn't around anymore, Sierra, LucasArts, Microprose, those are just some of them. Okay, now, something really important that happened was the Atari 2600 came out with a Pac-Man edition. And this Pac-Man edition had to be really downgraded because of the limitations of the 2600, and this caused a lot of problems. So they changed the gameplay from the arcade. I don't know how you do an arcade port and change the gameplay, but that's what they did. So it took one guy 6 months to make this thing, and they expected really high sales of this because Pac-Man like fever was going on. And so they produced 12 million cartridges. The problem is there were only 7 million 2600s out there. So like they made 5 million more cartridges than there were Atari 2600s. The idea being, hey, we're going to sell like a whole lot more of these things. Now it ended up being number one seller on the 2600. They sold 7 million of their 12 million, but they got stuck with 5 million cartridges, and that was a huge hit for them. These are all the changes that they made to the game, and that really ticked people off. And this is very, very quickly what the game looked like. There's no waka waka waka. The warp tunnel's in a totally different spot. It's not vertical. Like, there's tons wrong with this thing. Okay, the second thing that happened was E.T. was a big movie. Christmas was coming, and Atari said, okay, let's license this game. So games normally take a year. They licensed the thing in June for $25 million, and in July 27th, they say, okay, start programming this thing, and you have to be done September 1st. So take a whole year of development, squish it down into like 2 months. They skipped all the audience testing. It had to be in stores December 1st. Grandma's bought E.T., but all the kids wanted Pitfall. So a huge miss. 3.5 of the 4 million cartridges that were returned. Okay, so Atari got them all back, and that created a huge problem. They lost $42.5 million on this thing. If they had just sat at home and did nothing, they would still have the money. But because they decided to rush this thing, they decided to do that. And so that brings us to the end of the video game market. It's all over, and you'll find out what happens next week.